Another explanation of what the critique of pure reason is about is its explanation of how the understanding creates a world of objects in sense experience that is law-governed. We can also say it is about how there is an experience of nature containing its objective regularities. All five senses are always on, although I may not be paying attention to them most of the time, and most of their inputs get ignored. Kant will want to show how a world that makes sense to us can come out of that multitude, that barrage, or the word he prefers, that manifold of seemingly random inputs that are in constant change. And it's just a great work due to its depth and originality. Don't wait for the movie to come out. Hello everyone, this is Chris here with another edition of Philosophers' Ideas between 10 minutes and 10 hours. This time it's more of a book report. Critique of Pure Reason by Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant is highly considered to be the greatest modern philosopher. He was born in 1724 in the East Prussian city of Königsberg, which is now Kaliningrad, Russia. He came from a modest background and was raised in a strict way in accordance with the Pietist sect of Lutheran Christianity. His parents ensured that he received a good education at the Collegium Fredericium. The young Kant earned a scholarship for his first 4 years at the University of Königsberg, and for a brief time he worked as a tutor in neighboring towns to finance his further education, but otherwise lived his whole life in Königsberg. At the university, he would eventually become full professor of logic and metaphysics in 1770. At about the same time, Kant had found in a bookstore a copy of a German translation of David Hume's Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding. Of Hume's work, Kant stated that it had awoken him out of a dogmatic slumber, and as a result, Kant went to work on what is called the critical philosophy period of his writing career. This period starts in 1781 with the publication of the first edition of his most important work, Kritik der reinen Vernunft, or Critique of Pure Reason. The book itself is not an easy read. Kant introduces his own terminology and has a style that requires getting used to. However, he does define his terms and generally says what he means. It is often said that Kant was not a good professor of himself in his writing because the most important sentences and paragraphs do not grab the reader's attention and seem unimportant when reading them. And my purpose here is to help the beginner to the book know what to look for and see what is happening as it unfolds. It helps to know what he's trying to do. But definitely, the critique needs to be on your bucket list because its influence has a wide range, and it's just a great work due to its depth and originality. Don't wait for the movie to come out. For the most part, the ideas in Hume's work, to which Kant will formulate an answer, are Hume's ideas of necessary connection and what has come to be called Hume's fork. Hume's chapter of the idea of necessary connection is a well-written and argued statement of skepticism that disputes that we have knowledge of causes and effects. Instead, we end up with beliefs that we consider to be very reasonable. Much of what we claim to know about the world in our daily lives centers around the concept of causality, or necessary connection. The idea that when we have A, it will necessarily be followed by B. But whence comes this idea? We see fire accompanied by heat. We see a billiard ball hit by another subsequently move. But we don't see the third term, the one thing making the other happen. We never see power in the object that we end up calling a cause. We see it happen that way so consistently, without exception, that it seems we can't help but to think that there must be, literally, a necessary connection. Then it must always be true that A causes B. Essentially, Hume is regarding this as an association of ideas. The more we see fire and experience the heat, the more we will associate those ideas such that when we have one, we will anticipate the other. He says, if we see the two things conjoined enough, we begin to feel a connection between them in our imagination. Hume does not deny that in order to go about our daily lives, we must make assumptions about causes and effects. If Hume wanted to move a campfire to the other side of the campsite, he would have built a second fire, rather than trying to carry the existing one over. The real problem is that our idea of necessary connection is based on an unstated presupposition that the future will be like the past. Without evidence that the future will be like the past, according to Hume, we do not know that A will be followed by B, or even that the sun will rise tomorrow, just because it has always done so in the past. Hume's inquiry ends with a classification of what kinds of propositions he thinks we can be capable of verifying to be true and how. The first type of proposition is the relation of ideas. This type of proposition we can know with absolute certainty because it is about the relation between the subject and the predicate of the sentence. If I say a horse is a horse, we see that it must be true because it is a tautology. It's simply saying a thing is itself. Denying it would create a contradiction. If I say a horse is a mammal, this would also count as a proposition known to be true based on relations of ideas. It must be true because a mammal is part of what we think a horse to be, what we mean by a horse. It is already expressed in the concept of the subject. Ultimately, this is a proposition about language rather than a proposition about a fact in the world. Likewise, if I say a rainy day is a wet day, no bachelors are married, or a triangle has three sides, we know similarly on the basis of language that they must be true. And Hume also thinks that the propositions of arithmetic are of this type, so that it is through relation of ideas that we know with certainty that 7 plus 5 equals 12. The second type of proposition Hume says we know to be true are what he calls matters of fact. A proposition that states a matter of fact is one that can be verified by sense experience and is about a particular thing. If I say, this pen writes with blue ink, or there is an oak tree in Johnson's backyard, these propositions can be known, but only about the particular things named. It is a contingent level of certainty rather than a necessary one, not being necessarily true of all pens, oak trees, or backyards. The third prong of Hume's fork are those propositions that state neither relations of ideas nor matters of fact. This type of proposition, for which he gives no name, may be true but cannot be known to be true. According to Hume, relations of ideas and empirical verifications are the ways that we can verify a proposition with certainty. For instance, that man has free will, or that man does not have free will, is in either case neither a relation of ideas, not based on what we mean by man, nor empirically verifiable. The propositions that make up this type are those that include the subject matter of metaphysics and ethics. Hume's fork is a modern instance of a hypothesis known as the impossibility of metaphysics, where the impossibility constitutes impossibility of being certain of our opinions. Hume ends the inquiry with an advice of what to do with a book that is about and seeks to establish such propositions. Cast it into the flames, for it can contain nothing but sophistry and illusion. For Kant, this represents a disaster. He thought that not only should philosophy answer the questions of what is it, how do I know it, and what should I do, ideally with demonstrable answers, but also pose the question of what can I hope. He was also an admirer of the natural sciences, and saw this as a threat in terms of the idea that they would depend for their validity upon an unprovable assumption. To replace Hume's fork, Kant draws two distinctions between judgments that are analytic or synthetic and those that are a priori or a posteriori. Kant wants to use the term judgment rather than proposition because the critique is about mental activity rather than its product, but here it makes no difference. Either way, Hume's fork has propositions that are either true by definition and known independently of experience, and those propositions that are not true by definition and require sense experience. Kant divides the two questions that Hume packed into one. A judgment is analytic or synthetic, according to whether the predicate is already thought in the concept of the subject, or whether it adds something not already thought in that concept. That a horse is a mammal qualifies as analytic, but the judgment that Johnson's horse won 2 races last year would add something not already thought about in the concept of horse, and thus be synthetic, where experience would connect the subject and predicate. A judgment is a priori or a posteriori in accordance with how we know it to be true or false. A judgment is a priori when we know it independently of sense experience. When sense experience is required, the judgment is a posteriori. So we have 4 theoretical possibilities for judgments: analytic a priori, analytic a posteriori, synthetic a priori, and synthetic a posteriori. The analytic a priori and synthetic a posteriori correspond to Hume's relations of ideas and matters of fact, respectively. Now let's look at the other 2 possibilities to see if we have a category of judgments that we know with certainty to be true. If Hume is correct, we cannot. How about the analytic a posteriori? According to Kant, we can ignore this, because when an analytic judgment refers to something in experience, such as a rainy day is a wet day, it is still known to be necessarily true on the basis of it being analytic. The a posteriori part, that this rainy day is wet, can be verified by experience, only regarding this instance, and provides no proof of the future. Knowing a posteriori means verification after the object is given, while knowing a priori means determining something about an object prior to its being given in experience. Accordingly, we will just consider all analytic judgments to be a priori, or relations of ideas in Hume's language, because our concepts already provide a synthesis of subject and predicate. Regarding the possibility of synthetic judgments a priori, however, Kant asserts that we do in fact have such knowledge in geometry, arithmetic, and the natural sciences. According to Kant, Hume was wrong about arithmetical judgments, such as 7 plus 5 equals 12, being analytic, or what he called relations of ideas. There is nothing in our concept of the union of 7 and 5 that tells us that it must total 12. Imagining this with larger numbers would show that a computation is required. From geometry, he gives us 2 examples of what is known a priori, but non-analytic. That the straight line between 2 points is the shortest cannot be analytic, because my concept of straight is of a quality, not a quantity. Through analytic judgments alone, I could also not establish that we could never have a triangle with one side of greater length than the sum of the other 2 sides. In a diagram of 2 triangles, I could show that I can reduce the sum of 2 sides a plus b to approach c by lowering the height, but then it turns into a straight line when a plus b equals c. But diagrams can only show and do not prove a property of triangles. This can only be known by an a priori argument. In physics, a judgment that all bodies are heavy is also one that adds something not found in the concept of a body. At the same time, these things are all known a priori. We know them to be true in all instances, with something determined about the object prior to being given an experience, where experience would only verify that particular instance. So for Kant, the question that the Critique of Pure Reason must answer is how synthetic judgments a priori are possible. That is, how they can be known to be true, or how there is a synthesis that experience alone and our concepts alone of the object are not giving us. This is Kant's explanation of the project of the Critique of Pure Reason in the introductory sections. Once the conditions under which we can have this knowledge are known, we will be in a position to determine what limits the speculative reason may have, should reason not be capable of discovering everything about which we may be curious. It is a critique of the pure reason in that it is the power of the pure a priori reason within us, of what is devoid of anything empirical, that is under question. Kant's complaint about his predecessors, who understood that reason's capacity to give us knowledge may be limited, is that they did not undertake a systematic examination of how reason gives us knowledge, so as to allow us to determine those limits and know in advance of an inquiry if we are seeking something beyond. Kant's answer to what the book is about is how synthetic judgments a priori are possible. This means how we can know something that is not known through sense experience and also not true by definition. In short, the answer is because the understanding is applying its own concepts to the object of a perception, acting as lawgiver or legislator, determining something about the object, as well as ordering it in the broad perception, in space and time. Ultimately, if Kant is right, we know, for instance, that a body in motion will remain in motion unless acted upon by outside forces, because it is a law of the understanding that I will perceive the object behaving in that way, even if in reality independent of me it does not behave that way. Likewise, when we witness an event that can be broken up into instances of time, we see causes occurring before effects, and thus must perceive things in a certain order, even if it happened differently in reality. The understanding as legislator in the realm of experience guarantees it as it presents it to me in experience, a world that is law-governed. It is because perception is not totally passive, with the understanding conditioning something within it. What we know in contemporary psychology about various optical illusions and how they are created illustrates something like it, although Kant does not argue from optical illusions. He argues from the ordering and the necessity of it. Another explanation of what the Critique of Pure Reason is about is its explanation of how the understanding creates a world of objects in sense experience that is law-governed. We can also say it is about how there is an experience of nature containing its objective regularities. We know we do experience it, and Kant will search for the necessary conditions that must hold for any object to be given to us in a law-governed world. Now, to some of us, this idea that the understanding is applying its concept to the object of a perception and ordering it in some way may seem too subjective, maybe even arbitrary. But we can draw a distinction between the subject and object, between the object as content of a perception within the subject, and the object as we conceive it to exist independently. When discussing Descartes and his project of doubt, I referred to his argument that because of its distance from the earth, Descartes has in effect two suns, one in his vision that is small, and one that he knows from astronomy to be very large. For another example, stand on a railroad track, look up in the distance and notice the rails meeting at a point. The fact that the train does not derail shows that the track in your vision must be distinct from the track that the train uses. So we know the mental object may be different from the physical one and must have its own, albeit mental, existence. Given this, we can, as Descartes did, question whether that physical object exists, and yes, potentially conclude later that it does. Saying that the mental representation or idea of an object is a different thing from the object itself is not the same thing as saying the object is not real. Kant will argue instead that the content of a perception, the representation or idea of an object, or the object as intuited, is caused by both an external object and a set of rules in the understanding within the perceiver, such that both must exist. The way that Kant will seek to establish the understanding conditioning the sense experience is commonly called the Transcendental Method. We know that we do have an experience of a law-governed world of objects. Kant will argue that without some ordering of the object within a multiplicity or manifold of sensations from sense organs in the understanding, the appearance of the object would not be possible. A proposition to the effect of, if not Q, then not P, is equivalent to the proposition, if P, then Q. If we already know that we have P, the perception of the object in this case, and if some Q would have to exist in the understanding to make it possible to have P, then a formal proof can be made that this Q is objectively real in some sense. Kant does not explicitly construct this proof, but it is the direction of his transcendental method to argue in this pattern, that if not for certain conditions in the understanding, our experience of a law-governed world of objects or synthetic judgments a priori, that we do in fact have, would not be possible. All five senses are always on, although I may not be paying attention to them most of the time, and most of their inputs get ignored. Kant will want to show how a world that makes sense to us can come out of that multitude, that barrage, or the word he prefers, that manifold, of seemingly random inputs that are in constant change. But it can only come about as certain conditions are presupposed. One condition will be that an object must be apprehended as existing in space and time, if it is to be apprehended at all. I cannot imagine what an extended object would be like in an experience if it was not in space, or maybe to perceive it as being in motion but not in time. There will also have to be some pure a priori concepts, or categories, that are applied to the object. For instance, causality will feature an effect that is the result of the cause that precedes it. Concepts like unity and particularity will allow for an object like that tree outside to be apprehended as a particular entity, separate from the ground out of which it grows and from the squirrel walking on a branch. In this way, our receptivity to the input of objects can combine with those concepts that have no empirical origin to produce a coherent whole that can include this thing being different from that thing and causing its motion. Space and time as forms or backgrounds of our outer and inner sense will combine with concepts in an interplay with intuition. The hypothesis of the mind as a blank slate at birth on which experience writes itself will have to fall as a dead letter. If Kant is right, the full explanation of why we see something is neither the object alone nor the mind alone, but an input from the senses conditioned by the understanding. Where Kant expresses this is one of the most important sections of the critique for any attempt to understand it. It is where he speaks about objects being given and objects being thought, although he does not mean thought consciously when he says an object is thought. At page 50 of the first edition, and page 74 of the second, he states, Our knowledge springs from two fundamental sources of the mind. The first is the capacity of receiving representations, receptivity for impressions. The second is the power of knowing an object through these representations, spontaneity in the production of concepts. Through the first, an object is given to us. Through the second, the object is thought in relation to that given representation, which is a mere determination of the mind. Intuition and concepts constitute, therefore, the elements of all our knowledge, so that neither concepts without an intuition in some way corresponding to them, nor intuition without concepts can yield knowledge. So here I have a statement of two capacities in combination to produce a full representation that could give me knowledge of a tree that is more than merely seeing it, but also as possibly constituting an entity subject to natural law. I have light from my eyes, and my ears translate sound waves into the rustling of the leaves, and I can add to these sensations by touching it. The object is a combination by uniting these sensations into the object being thought through these representations, such that a mere percept can become an apprehension that can yield empirical knowledge. In this case, the intuition needs to be separated from the knowledge. And so on the next page of either edition, Kant adds, if the receptivity of our mind, its power of receiving representations insofar as it is in any wise affected, is to be entitled sensibility, then the mind's power of producing representations from itself, the spontaneity of knowledge, should be called the understanding. Our nature is so constituted that our intuition can never be other than sensible. That is, it contains only the mode in which we are affected by objects. The faculty, on the other hand, which enables us to think the object of sensible intuition, is the understanding. To neither of these powers may a preference be given over the other. Without sensibility, no object would be given to us. Without understanding, no object would be thought. Thoughts without content are empty. Intuitions without concepts are blind. In terms of its table of contents, much of the critique seeks to justify this idea of a twofold interplay of faculties producing the experience of a world. There is a faculty of intuition that gives us sensibility, a literal ability to receive input from the object. The faculty of the understanding performs the function of spontaneity, thinking the object through these representations of it from sensibility. Much even in the table of contents is labeled transcendental, and the thing to understand from that is that what Kant intends by that term is to relate whatever he calls transcendental to what in sensibility and the understanding enables us to have the object given to us. By the transcendent, Kant means the object that is entirely independent of us and what relates to that. The transcendental aesthetic deals with the rules of receptivity, and the transcendental logic deals with the rules of the understanding. The transcendental analytic is about the contribution of the pure a priori concepts belonging to the understanding applied to objects to give us knowledge. The transcendental dialectic is the science of illusion, where we seek knowledge beyond what these processes can produce. Like Descartes before him, Kant states that we must have the ability within us to receive something from the object. Kant will go further and argue that there is the faculty of sensibility or intuition having two forms of sensible intuition, that are the subject of the section of the book called the Transcendental Aesthetic. Kant's summary of what occurs when an object is given is that objects are given to us by means of sensibility, and it alone yields us intuitions. They are thought through the understanding, and from the understanding arise concepts. So once again, we have the understanding that has its own concepts, and a sensibility that gives us intuition of objects. The object being thought here refers to the understanding's processes, not as subject to the will. However, just because it does not come from the will does not prove that it must come totally from the object alone, with no faculty within us that may contribute. For Kant, mental activity always involves the unity of processes wrapped up in what seems to us in spontaneous consciousness to be just one mental act. One of the most important requirements for the appearance of an object is that it be given to us as existing in space and time. As for an inner experience, such as that of our own thoughts, space is not required, but it must exist in time. Space and time will be the forms of intuition, space for outer experience and time for inner experience. They are what is left over after we extract out all thoughts and representations from sensations and contributions from the understanding, leaving us to think about only pure sensibility. Space and time have certain qualities that make them suitable for this purpose. Neither space nor time are empirical concepts derived from the world. Space must be presupposed for me to represent an object as in relation to other objects. Coexistence and succession require that time also be presupposed as underlying all our representations of things. Space and time are necessary a priori representations that Kant calls pure intuitions. We can imagine space as empty of objects, but not a total absence of space. We can imagine a time frame void of appearances, but not an absence of time. We also conceive of space as one all-embracing space. However, we may divide it up, and also one all-embracing time, with any parts as parts of a continuous infinite whole. We conceive of both time and space as infinite magnitudes, where any segment is a part of a whole given as unlimited. Space and time thus become a necessary background in which the object in appearance must appear, if it is to appear at all. These are the forms of outer and inner sense. Kant believes that they do not inhere in objects and are not part of the external world. Kant argues further that space, as an a priori intuition, makes geometry possible. Geometry tells us the properties of space and does so apodictically, that is, with absolute certainty and consciousness of its necessity. It does so while yielding us propositions that go beyond the concept, that is, synthetic propositions. This is true of Kant's example of any triangle never having one side of greater length than the sum of the other two. This cannot be derived from the concepts of the terms involved. For this, our representation of space must lie in intuition, rather than in something empirical, which cannot furnish us with apodictic certainty. This intuition must be found prior to any perception of an object. Kant now argues that this outer intuition which precedes the objects themselves can only exist if this intuition has its seat in the subject himself. It is only under this assumption that we have the possibility of geometry as a science yielding synthetic a priori knowledge. In other words, it is because what geometry really tells us about is the a priori properties of an intuition within us, rather than telling us something about the world, although the world of experience must still conform to those properties. Time as an a priori intuition makes possible axioms of time as synthetic knowledge a priori, such as time having only one dimension and different times not being simultaneous. Concepts of alteration in motion as alteration of place are also relevant here. Kant says, only in time can two contradictorily opposed predicates meet in one and the same object, namely, one after the other. This is how we can have a priori synthetic knowledge of motion. And this will also be important in terms of establishing causality. Space and time as a priori intuitions will make possible our sensibility. Likewise, we will need an element that allows for the spontaneity within us, that is the operation of the understanding. This will also be something that cannot be derived from our experience of it, if it is to make experience possible. It will consist in a group of pure a priori concepts called categories that will be applied to the object. To find a clue in identifying these concepts, the logic professor within Kant will come to the fore. The logic of his time is largely the Aristotelian logic of the syllogism. This he uses to construct a table of judgments that describes what type of propositions we could form. For instance, the syllogisms have propositions within them having a quality and a quantity. In addition, when needed, we can also state the modality, whether it is true necessarily or conditionally. Also, we can form judgments that are hypothetical or disjunctive, as well as categorical. These types of judgments and classification of them form a clue as to what concepts may provide the synthesis between subject and predicate in a synthetic a priori judgment that makes such knowledge objective and necessary. One thing to note is that a statement that we make can fall under more than one judgment type. If I say it is necessarily true that a triangle has three angles, I am positively certain the modality of necessity to a universal of triangles with a categorical statement. Likewise, if I say Socrates is not a horse, I am negating a proposition that is singular and contingent. It is Kant himself who is deciding here to arrange these types of statements into four triads. In some sense, the third term of each he thinks of as a unity of the previous two, but it is not always the case of the triad consisting of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. Kant uses his table of judgments as a clue to the construction of the table of categories, based on the premise that the same faculty that makes those judgments will also apply its pure a priori concepts to the manifold of sensory inputs and give us a world of objects in a unity of apperception. In other words, his justification from going from judgments to categories is that the same faculty performs both functions. The process in which the unity of the manifold occurs will be what Kant calls the subjective or transcendental synthesis. These categories will function as rules for the ordering of a multiplicity or manifold of sensations into a coherent unity. Each category is related to a particular type of judgment. It is also important to note that in each case the category cannot be an object of experience. For instance, I may have a plurality of objects around me, but none of them may itself be a plurality. Not a plurality of, but just a plurality. In the sections of the Transcendental Analytic that follow the presentation of this table of categories, Kant seeks to establish how this subjective synthesis occurs, as well as proving that it must occur within a consciousness that contains all of its representations, such that I am an I, that has this law-governed world of objects in my continuing consciousness. What all this will mean was that we will only know nature and metaphysics in terms of the objects as a content of perception, when we draw the distinction between an object as a content of a perception and an object as thing in itself existing independently of us. We can only claim to know about the object of experience. Kant will therefore have a distinction between the transcendental and the transcendent, between what is in experience and what transcends it, between what he calls phenomena and noumena, where he distinguishes between the objects in experience, or object as intuited, and the thing in itself. Of things in themselves as they exist independently of us, Kant insists we cannot know to what degree they may correspond to how we perceive them, but also presents an argument that they must exist. This is his theory of Transcendental Idealism. For Kant, it is not a question of whether the object in experience or the object as thing in itself is real. They both have a reality as what they are. He wants to emphasize that he is not proposing a dogmatic idealism that says the thing in itself is mere appearance. Instead, he counsels us to remember that the representation of the thing as an appearance is mere appearance, or just a representation. He still calls it a form of idealism because his theory states that the world as we experience it through our senses and describe in our sciences is the world of our representations or ideas of it. It is of that we have knowledge. Kant believes that we cannot extend our concepts to things in themselves to discover their nature. This is especially true if we are seeking the nature of something that can never be an object of experience. God, free will, and immortality can still be thought without contradiction, but just cannot be proven because they cannot be objects of an experience. Kant therefore re-invokes the scholastic distinction between what is known from reason and what is known as a matter of faith. Kant says of the speculative reason in the preface to the second edition, in order to arrive at such insight, it must make use of principles which, in fact, extend only to objects of possible experience, and which, if also applied to what cannot be an object of experience, always really change this into an appearance, thus rendering all practical extension of pure reason impossible. I have therefore found it necessary to deny knowledge in order to make room for faith. So this is a partial completion of Hume's skeptical program. Nevertheless, it seeks to save the sciences and determine that yes, there is necessary connection and knowledge of the world is possible, if only in reference to the world of experience. So far, this is Critique of Pure Reason 101 and an instruction on the first about 100 pages of it. If you like it, check out my video on Kant's moral theory. Check out my other videos on my channel page. Hit the like and subscribe buttons. Thanks for watching.